You can't hear me, can you? Hello? I didn't see any hands waving. I just gave about a 10-minute long sermon about grades on exams. I'm not going to do it again. It was bad enough to start with. It's recorded. If you want to hear about the grades and what I think about getting bad grades, look at the recording. We are now in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia getting ready to write a constitution, and what I was saying when I started was the people that showed up there really didn't know what they were going to do. Some of them thought that they were going there to adjust some problems with the Articles of Confederation. Some of them, probably Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, thought, let's throw the whole Articles of Confederation in the trash and start over again. Some of them, when they found out what Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were planning to do, walked out. They quit before it was over with. Some of them sat there through the whole long thing, and it lasts all summer long in a sweaty room with the windows boarded over so nobody'd peek in. No aircon back then, of course. Some of them sat through that whole process, and when it was all over with, they just wouldn't sign it. They disagreed with it. 2/3 of the New York delegation walked out, leaving Alexander Hamilton the only representative from New York. Most of the Virginians hung around. Marylanders didn't sign on. The influences they had, James Madison showed up with a trunk full of books. He had writings by people like John Locke, who talked about the social contract. What's the responsibility of the government? What's the responsibility of the people? We've already used that social contract in the Declaration of Independence. David Hume, English political philosopher, had one bee in his bonnet, and they paid attention to that. A republic must produce laws. If we're going to have a republic, you have to have laws. The rule of law he believed in. William Blackstone really believed it. He was a big-time judge in England. He wrote an enormous volume, a series of volumes on English law. And British had a constitution. It wasn't written. It was all in the minds of the people that governed. And Blackstone was one of the first people that really codified it, really put down the different forms of law, and there were several different forms. James Madison brought Blackstone on law with him. Big old book. Then there was Montesquieu, Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brie de Montesquieu. He believed in separation of powers. He didn't believe in democracy, by the way. He believed we ought to have a king, but he believed that there should be limits and that there should be different branches of government which would balance each other off. Separation of powers. We're going to adopt that into our thinking. When they finally, most of them got together, they met in what you call a committee of the whole. A committee of the whole is where everybody in the organization is sitting there and everybody votes on every issue. And they quickly found out they weren't going to get anywhere by doing that. So they subdivided into small committees. Let's see if I can find on these slides for you. First of all, they set up rules, how they're going to do this. They make George Washington the chairman or president, whatever you want to call it, not like the president of the United States. Made a fellow named William Jackson the secretary. Right next to Washington, sitting in this room for most of the meeting, was James Madison. He's the one that really took detailed notes. They decided that 7 states have to be present for anyone to do any business. That's a quorum. That's the minimum number of people participating under which you can do business. In Texas, we just had a big issue where people from one party walked out so that they couldn't do business because they didn't have a quorum. Well, this kind of principle existed way back then. Finally, so that everybody could speak freely without the fear of retribution or anything like that, so people kind of just throw out ideas, they decided this has to be secret. We won't tell anybody about what anyone said in this room until everyone's dead. Believe it or not, considering how our government is right now, believe it or not, they kept that promise. Dolly Madison, whose husband took such good notes, released those notes for publication after James Madison died. That's the only way we really know what went on in there. By the way, being secret, in the summertime in Philadelphia, with no air conditioning, with the windows boarded over, if you've ever been in a stinky locker room, that's probably what it smelled like. Must have been unpleasant. Yeah, they went home at night. They weren't allowed to take what they were talking about with them. They weren't allowed to discuss it outside. That was what they all agreed upon. So that they could throw out ideas without fear of someone trying to beat them up for doing it. Some of the issues. A lot of them were thinking about having a bicameral legislature that's with two parts. One of the issues was, will both of them be elected the same way? Will both of them come into office the same way? How big will they be? What does proportional representation really mean? A proportion of what? The total number of humans in your state, the total number of taxpayers in your state, the total number of property owners in your state. What does it mean? Then, if they're going to have an executive branch, what's it going to be like? 1 man, 3 men? Will it be a triumvirate like the Romans had for a while? Didn't work very well, by the way. Seemed like 2 of them would always die off somehow or other. What offenses could a president do that would make it possible to kick him out of office? They also talked about slavery. One thing you'll notice in the Constitution is the word slave is not mentioned in the Constitution. They tiptoe all around it. And this could be a reason that they wouldn't get this done. Then eventually, they're going to come to a gentleman's agreement. In order to get this thing done that we're trying to do, whatever we want to call it, we won't talk about the issue of slavery or abolishing slavery for the next 20 years until our country gets its feet on the ground. They're going to arrive at that when they're talking about other things. They also argued over court system. Who picks the judges? Do they get elected? Does the legislature appoint them? Does the president appoint them? How does that work? Lots of different arguments. Okay. I didn't put the slide up on that, and I'm not going to. What I want you to do is kind of have a feel for concepts. Probably the biggest argument that they had was, how do we determine how many representatives each state gets? Now, you can imagine Virginia was the most populous state. They wanted to have representation based on how many people they had. New Jersey was a small state. Rhode Island wasn't represented at the time. New Jersey was a small state, and you might imagine they wanted every state to have the same number of votes. We're equal partners, after all. That's what they're going to have to solve. And they can't solve it in this big committee of a whole, so they break down into small committees to try and answer some of these questions. Then they're going to come back and report to the entire group. The fight over representation, as I said, was the big one. And there's several issues. Let me put this slide up for you. There's several issues involved with this fight over representation. One is something that we're going to reach a compromise about the general idea of representation. They call it the Great Compromise. Some people call it, so you write down both of them, Great Compromise equals Connecticut Compromise, because this compromise was first suggested by representatives from Connecticut. Let's do it 50-50. Let's have one house of the legislature based on each state gets an equal number of representatives, and have the other house based on population. Virginia favored that. Virginia put forward an idea for the Constitution. We won't get into it in too many technical details about it. Massachusetts had their own ideas and a very complex constitution that they had for their state. New Jersey comes out with a small state point of view. They want a single house. They don't want a bicameral legislature. They want a unicameral legislature. And they want the president appointed by the legislature. But finally they agree on this great compromise. They take some of the New Jersey plan, some of the Virginia plan, take the best points of each, and they come out with this great compromise. The Senate will have an equal number of representatives or an equal number of senators from each state. They work it out to be 2. Now listen to this carefully, because this is going to come back all the way through the semester. They agreed that the senators would not be elected by popular vote, but the senators would be chosen by the legislatures of each state. In other words, the Virginia Assembly, we call it an assembly now, they're not calling it the House of Burgesses anymore, they pick 2 senators. Each state picks 2, and they're chosen by the legislature. However, in the case of the House of Representatives, they will be elected by popular election. There's kind of a side note here. The question of who gets to vote was very interesting. Each state made up their own mind, more or less. Some states had property requirements. Some states said you had to be a taxpayer. Some states had almost universal male suffrage or voting rights. New Jersey actually let women vote. Oh my goodness. They changed their mind after about 20 years and changed their charter. It's going to take until 1919 before that's fixed. Way beyond our time of interest right now. Right at the very end of all of this, by the way, George Washington tended to sit in the back corner there in a comfortable chair and say nothing but look dignified. That was his job, to maintain order. James Madison's busy taking notes because the secretary, the guy they chose for secretary, took really terrible notes, like some of the people in this class maybe. Nobody could read them after a couple of years, so Madison's notes are what we really know about it. Right at the end of all of this, before they go to the main assembly to report on the results, there's another argument that gets out. And this argument has to do with the slave population. In Virginia, in the Carolinas and all of that, they want to be allowed to count all of their slaves as part of their population, because of course it'll give them more representatives. But the people up in the north who don't have slaves anymore, because most of the states have already outlawed slavery by that time, they're going, whoa, 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 wait a minute. They're not people. Your own law says they're not people. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If they're not people, then you can't count them as people. It got into a bargaining thing. And they came up with something they called the 3/5 compromise. And that in no way is anyone saying a slave is worth 3/5 of a person. It was just one side started at 0 to be counted, and the other side started at everybody can be counted. And they went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and they finally got to the number of 3/5 of the slave population may be counted. Probably kind of a victory for the southern states in as much as they probably shouldn't have been allowed to be counted unless they were allowed to vote, and et cetera, et cetera. The little note at the bottom of this slide, it says 1 to 40,000 changed to 1 to 30,000. The big states, when they were deciding, okay, now we know that representation in the House of Representatives will be based on population, how many people do you need to have to get one representative? And the big state said, how about 1 to 50,000 or 1 to 40,000, something like that. And the little state said, that's bigger than our total population. What are you trying to do here? Are you trying to play a cute one on us? And they started bickering again. And this is in the overall assembly starts bickering about this. And finally George Washington opens his mouth. I guess he was tired of sitting in that hot, sweaty room. They'd been there for more than a month. And he just spouted out a number and he said, let's do 1 to 30,000 and stop arguing. And that was accepted. So you have two really big compromises. One, the Great Compromise, otherwise known as the Connecticut Compromise. The other one, the 3/5 Compromise. We talked about all the influences. I'm flipping through this really fast because I'm doing it in a different order than it's presented on here. Committee of Detail started working on it on the 24th of July. They were pretty much done with everything, but they had agreed when they started that up to the day we publish this, it's subject to change. The Committee of Detail starts working on this on the 24th of July. Already people are writing newspaper articles and things like that for ratification or against ratification, and as soon as it goes out to the people on the 7th of September, they're going to publish arguments for and against the Constitution. North Carolina in particular are against the Constitution because they say that the way you've written this, you haven't guaranteed anybody's personal rights. And other people say, wait a minute, the principle of the Constitution guarantees their rights. North Carolina says we won't ratify. Maryland gets their nose into it. Some of the other states as well. New York also. And so there's a gentleman's agreement. If you vote to ratify the Constitution, we promise that our first order of business, once the Constitution is in effect, the Congress will pass a Bill of Rights. And eventually they're going to do that. They're going to approve, in 1789, 12 articles for the Bill of Rights. They started out with 17, and then some people thought they're redundant. Some of them say more or less the same thing. So they're going to send out 12 amendments to the Constitution. Only 10 of them will be ratified. Let's talk about what we've got for a government. 3 branches. The executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. We will maintain separation of powers. That creates a balance of power. The president will be elected through a college of electors, the electoral college. In other words, the people in the different states will vote for representatives who will go to Congress and vote for the president. Later in our history, sometimes that causes trouble because sometimes the guy you voted for to go vote for George Washington decides to vote for somebody else on the way to Congress. And there was no law in most states that compelled him to vote the way he said he was going to vote. But for the time being, that's how it's going to work. For the Senate, once again, 2 senators will be chosen by each state legislature. For the House of Representatives, popular election. How about the judiciary? How do we handle the appointment of judges? And they decide that the president will nominate justices and the Senate will be responsible for giving what they call their advice and consent, for okaying the nomination. And how will judges serve? What kind of terms? Now the president's got 4 years, senators 6 years, representatives 2 years. How about judges? And this is a really important decision they make, that the judges in the federal system will serve for the duration of good behavior. What does that mean? They will serve for life unless they do something bad enough to get them kicked out of office, unless they break the law themselves. And to get rid of them, you have to impeach them just like you would have to impeach a president. That's really important. Why would you do that? Why would you say that a judge should serve for life? Anybody got any ideas? Anybody got thoughts? It's a really simple motivation. There's a really simple motive for it. Why you don't want to elect judges. Now, a lot of states do, including this one. We elect our lower level judges. The reason we want to do that is to remove the justices from the political orbit. In other words, they're not worried about getting votes. All they're worried about is applying the law. So no one can influence them with promises of, I'll vote for you next time, or I'll guarantee that my county votes for you, or any of that kind of silliness, because they're there for life. Nobody can touch them. That has its good points, and sometimes its bad points, but over history, up until modern times, you will notice that two positions in our government tend to slide towards the center the longer they're in office. One is the President of the United States. A lot of presidents, get elected because I'm super liberal. Other ones get elected because I'm super right. But if they're going to run the country and not have mayhem, they slide towards the middle because they're responsible for everybody, not just their party. And judges the same way. If you watch them, for example, our Chief Justice now does a lot of voting that makes him look like he's liberal, but he was selected because he was conservative. Maintaining balance. These people become totally concerned with the principles of the Constitution. Okay, so we've got a government. We've got a lot of support. These guys are the people that were, oops, no slide there. Take a look at this slide. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison all urged their states to ratify the new Constitution. They got together and they wrote articles called the Federalist Papers. Write that down, Federalist Papers. I think Alexander Hamilton wrote the most articles. Sometimes they collaborated, so it's hard to tell really who wrote all of what. But they always signed their name Publius, named after a Roman consul. They'd all had classical educations. People that didn't like the Constitution, like Robert Yates, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, they also wrote, and a lot of times they used pseudonyms instead of their real names. Gerry, though, started writing just with his own name. He didn't care. They were afraid that the central government would be too powerful. So that makes them anti-federalists, right? Okay. New government's established. Congress is seated on the 4th of March, 1789. George Washington was elected unanimously. He's the only president in our history to have all of the electors vote for him. 69 of them there were. They did go through the electoral system. I used to think maybe they just did it in the room when they were still working on this, but not at all. Now, the different states, some of them didn't even get involved in it. New York didn't because they were too late to get organized. North Carolina and Rhode Island didn't participate in the election because they hadn't ratified the Constitution yet. George Washington will arrive in town about a month late. He won't get into town until the 6th of April to accept his election. He'll set up his cabinet early on. By the way, John Adams was stunned to find out he'd been elected vice president. He got about either 34 or 35 out of 69 votes, but all the rest of the votes were split in between 10 other candidates. George Washington and John Adams and friends are going to pick the first presidential cabinet, and they don't pick it according to what faction you belong to. You're going to see people from both factions. For Secretary of State, eventually they're going to choose Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of the Treasury will be Alexander Hamilton. There's an anti-federalist and a federalist right there next to each other. Secretary of War, I can't even remember the first one they picked. He didn't live long enough to really function as Secretary of War. So then they went to Henry Knox, the artillery general, the man that brought the guns down to Dorchester Heights. They made him Secretary of War. They appointed a Postmaster General eventually, not all right away, by the way, John Osgood. After they write some laws to flesh out what the Constitution says about the justice branch of the government, the judicial branch, they will appoint an Attorney General named Edmund Randolph from Virginia, very definitely an anti-federalist. And for a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, they will pick the Federalist, John Jay. So they were balanced. George Washington did not believe in the party system. He thought it would cause conflict, disunity. Poor old John Jay, when he became the Chief Justice of the United States, and by the way, when someone says the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, they're wrong. There is no such position. He's the Chief Justice of the United States. He's one of the Associate Justices on the Supreme Court, but they call him the Chief Justice. Initially, there's only going to be 5 Associate Justices. Our country was already pretty big geographically, and so they didn't have enough federal judges. So all of these justices on the Supreme Court are also going to be assigned to different court districts, and they're going to have to go charging down to Virginia or wherever else those courthouses are to rule on some cases. One example I'll give you a little bit later, John Marshall. He's not in office yet. There's the votes. By the time New Hampshire ratified, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island hadn't ratified. But by the time they have the election, New York and Virginia will be able to vote on it. North Carolina and Rhode Island are kind of left out. They don't get, Rhode Island doesn't ratify the Constitution until 1790. There's the first cabinet. Got that memorized? Okay, moving right on. What are they going to do? Well, first thing they're going to do is write the Bill of Rights. We talked about that already. Then they're going to write a Judiciary Act. This is how the courts are set up. The Constitution says that we'll have a judicial branch, but it doesn't have the framework for how that'll be organized. So the Congress passes the Judicial Act in 1789, and once they've done that, Edmund Randolph will be appointed Attorney General. Then they're going to look at money. Remember, one of the weaknesses of the Continental Congress was they couldn't collect money. They're going to pass a Tariff Act. to collect tariff on imports. This is a first fight between some Federalists and some Anti-Federalists. And it's kind of interesting because remember James Madison, we call him the father of the Constitution. He's going to come out pretty clearly Anti-Federalist in this. He's angry at the British. So he suggests that we write into the tariff law that anyone who doesn't have a trade agreement with us has to pay a higher tax rate. It works out to 30-50. If you have a trade agreement with us, you pay 3/5 of what you have to pay if you don't have a trade agreement with us. Alexander Hamilton says, hold that, wait a minute. We are trying to build our economy. We have no economy. We have no money. If you do that, the number one trade partner that we've ever had is going to just sneer at us and not do business with us. Who is he talking about? He's talking about the British. Even though we've had a war and all this, our biggest market is England. He wins this one. Hamilton wins this one because everyone knows that we have to build our business, our commerce. 1790, they passed a Copyright Act law. What's that all about? Patent and copyright is to encourage people to create new technology, new ideas, and what have you. It makes it profitable for them because if they can patent something, then they get money if anyone uses their patent. They'll finally get ready to organize the post office in 1792. So what have we got? 1790. Let's think about the country in 1790. We got about 4 million people. Of those, about 700, in between 700 and 750,000 are people of African origin. Less than 10% of those people lived outside the South. We're not even counting Indians yet. We didn't even count them in our census or anything yet. We had about 125,000 people of our population west of the Appalachian Mountains. Everybody else east of the mountains. Average white woman had 8 children. Whoa. Kentucky was about to become a state. Up in the Northeast, we had small farms, but we were quickly converting to manufacturing, and we weren't doing manufacturing in the South. Why? It has to do with the geographical feature. Of course, the South was better for growing crops because they had a longer growing season. But why was the North better for manufacture? Can anybody tell me? Tahoka? Why would we have manufacturing in the North and not so much in the South? Hale Center, take a stab at it.
The South were farmers.
Yeah, the South were farmers, but why didn't some of them, I mean, they were growing stuff like cotton by this time. Why didn't they manufacture textiles and things like that in the South? Reminds me of a similar issue right now. But it all had to do with power. What were factories run on? What kind of power were they run on?
Materials for
Try again. You're cutting out.
They had more materials for manufacturing.
What kind of materials? I mean, the South had cotton. The North didn't have any. It has to do with power. What made factories go? They didn't have electricity. They didn't have steam. What made those factories run? Nobody? No. Coal's only good for making, someone in this room said coal you only use to manufacture steam. They didn't have steam engines. What made the factories go? Giant water wheels. The South didn't have rapid moving water, the North did. The North was rockier. Rivers like the Passaic River, the Mystic River, the Charles River up, remember when Paul Revere made his ride, up there. They all ran through restricted banks and the water moved fast, and that would turn water wheels. And they could set up canals with fast moving water to drive the water wheels. The South had nothing but big, wide, muddy rivers. That's how that started out. The middle states, kind of in between, they had some, well, the Passaic River's in New Jersey, you could consider that a middle state. So they had some fast moving water, but they also grew a lot of tobacco. They had a lot of agriculture. They also did a lot of trade. Philadelphia was a large seaport at that time, probably our largest seaport. So they were balanced, probably the most balanced the middle states were. Down south, agricultural, no big cities, spread out farms, always growing. Ethnically, the people that ran things were white and the people that did the work were black. The more cotton they grew, the more dependent on slavery they were. To the point when you get 50, 60 years down the line, cotton is it. Cotton is king. Smart people in the South who weren't listened to by the big money people, smart people said, if we depend only on cotton, sooner or later that will destroy us. But gradually cotton gets hold, tobacco fades away a little bit. We'll talk about the Industrial Revolution next time around, I think. We've got Department of State, Treasury, War, Judiciary Act, the Bill of Rights is done. Let's talk about the Bill of Rights. Do I have that on here? First Amendment. You guys all know the Bill of Rights? Any of you? You will by the time we take the next couple of quizzes. First Amendment. Freedom of religion. Free exercise of speech. Freedom of assembly. Peaceable assembly, by the way. You do not have the freedom to assemble and destroy things. Freedom of the press. Freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Second Amendment. Everybody in Texas knows that one. The right to bear arms. Third Amendment. Now, where the heck did they come up with this? No soldier shall, in the time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner as prescribed by law. What were they guaranteeing that wouldn't happen to them? Did it happen to them when the British were there? The Quartering Act. This is a direct reaction to the Quartering Act. We really don't care. I don't think anyone's ever tried to force me to put up a soldier in my house. Of course, we only have Marines in my house, but that's a different story. Fourth Amendment. Freedom against unreasonable search and seizures. Warrants can only be issued upon probable cause. They have to be specific. What are they reacting to here? Writs of assistance. Writs of assistance. They really don't want anything like that to exist in our country. Fifth Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising with the military during time of war. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy. That's double jeopardy. Can't be tried for the same crime twice. The same act twice. No person can be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. That's why you hear people sometimes when they're being forced or asked questions they don't want to answer, say, I plead the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No private property can be taken for public use without just compensation. Fifth Amendment. We're running out of time, guys. Read these amendments. See if you can understand where they came from as far as why we're worried about them. And we'll talk about the last two amendments, the 9th and 10th Amendments, a whole lot in between now and the time we're done with this semester. Anybody that's got any questions or anything about their grades, or how to dig themselves out of a hole if they've constructed one, or what you're doing with my extra grades? Because some people's grades show up as over 100, but the grade leveler will come in and make them 100. Nobody gets more than 100. I write that on all my tests. I say maximum score 100. That's people that got lucky and did the extra credit questions and got everything else right too. Not too many of those, but there were a few. Okay, that's enough for the day. Let's call it quits. See you on Wednesday. I'm serious about asking questions. If you got questions, you better ask me.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes. Your conference is now over. Goodbye.